In the last chapter, we finally got some non-hunter-gatherers from Ingold. We got some herders or pastoralists, and in this chapter, we get even some gardeners or some people who grow plants, some non-hunter-gatherers, or people who might still hunt and gather, but are farmers even in Colombian farmers. And so I want to talk mostly focus in, obviously we're going to be doing still a little bit of compare contrast with hunting and gathering, but mostly focusing in on this horticulture idea. Now, like with herding, this idea that people went from gathering or simply collecting to growing is part of our mythology that horticulture and agriculture is the same thing as culture. There's that root word there, and that culture and the cultivation of plants then leads to being civilized, having a history, and all of those things. And so Ingold here talks about this idea that there is a transition between collecting to producing. That's basically when people start making things or making stuff, or to intervene in the natural world as a way of deliberately controlling it. And Ingold is drawing on here some people who are a person who was very concerned with the idea of labor. Friedrich Engels, who's of course Karl Marx's buddy, and Engels was also a reader of anthropology in the form of he read mostly blanking on our League of the Iroquois person, the Lewis Henry Morgan, of course. I sometimes give you out a Lewis Henry Morgan Award in your first year. Yes, the sort of counterpart, you might say, to Franz Boas in the Americas, was actually working, is kind of was in the Rochester region, was someone who was more, you might say, an amateur anthropologist, kind of pre-Boas, but had this idea of sort of the stages of humanity, stages of civilization, is often tagged as being the person who gave us the idea of a unilinear cultural development from the savage to the barbaric to the civilized. We'll talk a little bit. Lewis Henry Morgan always comes in at various points, but in any case, Friedrich Engels was reading Lewis Henry Morgan and others, and thinking about labor and what it meant to become a human society. And basically, this is, he wanted to locate that in this idea of production. Now, Gabe, you had a question about this and about the non-human animals. What were you thinking here?
I think I have like multiple questions, but the last one, if the distinction is that like animals, like they produce, because Engels like even agrees that they like produce things, they just don't do shit. They just don't do it like instinctually. No, like they do it instinctually. They don't do it deliberately. Like they don't choose to do it. Who's to say that like people also do like produce things instinctually?
Yeah, well, okay, so I guess I would say Ingold's view on this is going to be, he's actually trying to get us away from these dichotomies. But the sort of Marx and Engels' view of things is that, yes, non-human animals do a bunch of stuff to transform the world, but they don't have a plan for it in their heads first. And that's what was most important. So here, here it's on the top of page 78, which is, it is again, according to Engels, animals through their activities might exert lasting and quite radical effects on their environments. Oh, in fact, they would have known this from reading Lewis Henry Morgan on the American beaver and all the ways in which the beaver had transformed the environment. But these effects are by and large unintended. Again, this is Engels' view. The non-human animal, Engels thought, did not labor in its surroundings in order to change them. It had no conception of its task. The human, by contrast, always has an end in mind. And so the idea that the crucial part, or the critical part, is the idea that that they have an end in mind. We're going to be talking about this again with the classic Marx example later on. The classic example from Marx is when he says the difference between the bee and the beehive and the human architect, and he says it's I think he calls it the difference between the best bee and the worst human architect, because in fact many bees can make much better stuff than the worst human architect, and I would definitely put myself in there. But he says that the human architect has an image for what they want to make before they put it into the world, whereas the bee is just out there with it's just emanating from the body. So the idea is this idea of having deliberate control, a mental image which is then being realized in nature or in a product or some kind of thing that you have made. And so that's why when it comes to animals and plants, people are always talking about this process of breeding, because it's the most like what we want to think about as sort of engineering or producing. If you can, breed different plants together and make new creatures. And the idea is, as Engels put it, that's why everybody's always talking about artificial selection, that they're making things by art. And there's that rather amazing piece at the beginning, which I sometimes, which I often just skip over because it seems so fanciful, from Francis Bacon's was this idea of a utopia out there where they make all this stuff. We have large and various orchards and gardens, and we make by art in the same orchards and gardens trees and flowers that come earlier and later than their seasons, and they do all this stuff. They make things by art. Likewise, we make them greater or taller than their kind is, and contrariwise dwarf them and stay their growth. We make them more fruitful and bearing than their kind is, and contrariwise barren and not generative. And we make them differ in color, shape, activity, many ways. This was from 1624, the idea that you could make things through art. And I've underlined the word art there because we sometimes in our world, when we hear the word artificial, we get all down on it. We don't want the artificial. But this was a kind of, they really liked that. The idea that you were making things by art was emphasized because that was something good. And so this moment, the moment of domestication, of bringing all these plants under human control, as Engels put it, is seen as the decisive moment at which humanity transcended nature and was set on the path of history. So that up until this point, you have people who were basically biological creatures living in nature, living with the wild plants and animals. but as they bring themselves up, domesticate those plants. In the last class, we talked about domesticate those animals. They've pulled themselves up and are now above the natural world and able to do all these neat, cool things. And the next thing you know, you have Engels and Marx talking about overthrowing capitalism and setting up a utopian place where we make even more stuff better. I mean, you know, Marx and Engels weren't they weren't trying to get back to nature. They were trying to make even more, harness the productive capacities of the world. We've talked in previous classes how when it came to stereotypes about hunters and gatherers, that they were sort of savages and without culture, anthropology has been, in general, questioning those. We've tried to extend the idea of culture to all human beings. We've tried to question those ideas of someone like Darwin, that they don't have culture, they don't have government, they don't have. So we've basically tried to talk back to that mythology or that stereotype of the West. But on the issue of domestication, anthropology, I guess I would say, has been a little bit equivocal or different. On the one hand, a lot of anthropologists have celebrated the idea of the domesticators because they basically believe in this version of human history. So Friedrich Engels was not an anthropologist, of course, but he sort of lays the groundwork for a kind of anthropology which would celebrate this notion. And Engels quotes V. Gordon Childe, who is a very famous archaeologist, probably, I think, a Marxist archaeologist, which would make sense if you think about his relationship to Engels. And I found his book, Man Makes Himself, the classic study of the origin and progress of man, from earliest recorded history to the rise of modern civilization. This would have been sort of required reading back in the old days, especially for archaeologists. And so, you know, again, 1951, this idea that man had made himself, domesticated himself, and domesticated the world. Scary, but there it was. And then there's Godelier, who has this 5-part distinction here. And we won't go into we won't go through all the funny things that the French think. But what Engels says is still the key line for Godelier is between the wild and the domesticated. Godelier gets a little more complicated when he talks about the mental representations and how, in some ways, the hunter-gatherers are sort of, I guess, more mental, more cultural even than the others, which this is on page 79. I guess since we're there, Godelier reaches the rather paradoxical conclusion that it is in the hunter and gathering societies that the boundary between the mental and the material, between culture and nature, is most clear cut, which is, again, odd. But anyway, well, he basically does retain this idea that there's a line between the wild and the domesticated. So a lot of anthropologists have kind of basically believed that, you know, when it comes to domesticating plants and animals, this was a key transitional moment in the rise of the modern. There's another reason, and I think as I was trained as an anthropologist, when I was taking a class with Sidney Mintz, he got really into the domestication idea because of how much it showed had been contributed to the West from people who were not part of, who were not celebrated at all. And so that this was a kind of human achievement. And what he would do is he would go back and talk about all the stuff that people in other parts of the world had domesticated, like wheat, potatoes, rice, and corn, or the cow, the sheep, the goat, and the pig. And then he said, and what did Europe give us? The Brussels sprout. Nobody likes Brussels sprouts, so does anybody like Brussels sprouts? Yeah, they're great. Gabe's like, no way. I love them, but it's like you can't live on them. You have to have some other stuff, namely bacon. So anyway, his point is that there's hardly anything that was domesticated in Europe. There's hardly anything that is a new domesticate. As I tell people, you never go down to this grocery store and they're like, hey, we got this new thing that science has given you. I mean, you get some stuff, but it's not good. So everything we eat was domesticated by people who were smarter than us thousands of years ago. So that's one of the ways in which we have responded. And the other thing that anthropologists have done is they've questioned. So in contrast to, say, Engels or Child, or we've also questioned this idea that everything is getting better and better and better with the domestication of plants and animals. As I mentioned in that, in the volume Man the Hunter, edited by Richard Lee. Richard Lee has been huge in questioning the idea that hunters and gatherers had it so bad. He's probably the one who's most responsible for the idea that they only needed to do 10 to 15 hours of work every week to survive, the most responsible for helping people understand how much gathering rather than hunting was a part of their subsistence. I think that, I don't know if you've been ever assigned to read his kind of most enduring article that gets read in anthropology classes is called Eating Christmas in the Kalahari, where he figures out that they tease each other to keep them all at the same level. And so you know that because they have this reciprocity between them. So it's a fun article if you ever get to read. So this, Richard Lee has been hugely important in questioning the idea that there simply is that we get things, that we're better off if we transition to agriculture. And then we talked about Marshall Solins, who appeared in that Man the Hunter volume, and then Stone Age economics, the idea that there's the original affluent society. And then there's an article that I still it probably is it's a ripoff of Richard Lee. It really is. He plagiarizes from Richard Lee, but it's Jared Diamond's worst mistake in the history of the human race, in which he basically claims that agriculture was the source of us all going downhill and has led to so many problems. So anthropology has spent a decent amount of time questioning the idea that there's this progressive relationship between domestication and hunting and gathering, but probably we haven't really intensely questioned the very notion of domestication, which is, of course, what Engels will do here. And so Engels goes into 4 ethnographic examples, nice little summaries from 4 different societies where they grow things. He starts off in the Ashwar of in the upper Amazon, and basically in each of these societies you're going to see something that looks like our line between the wild and the domestic, but turns out not to be. And so in this Amazonian region, they do have these gardens that are that are at you go through the garden and then you get to the edge of a forest, And well, they see the garden not as kind of as opposed to the forest, but as a scaled down version of it. So you have the big forest, and then you have this little garden. It's sort of a matter of scale, and the forest is an untidy garden. Human society is a scaled down version of the society of nature. The garden plot temporarily realizes the virtualities of a homely wilderness. So not exactly, or certainly not corresponding to our usual ideas of the wild and the domestic. Marilyn Strathern's ethnography of, I think he's getting this from Marilyn Strathern's work and not Andrew Strathern. They were married back then, so better check that. Oh yes, this is actually Marilyn Strathern's work in Papua New Guinea, in Mount Hagen. And again, they have this differentiation between things that are, probably this word is not pronounceable in my language, Bo and Romy, which initially looks like, because it covers several different terrains, our distinction between domesticated and wild. But if you look a little closely, what it is whether something is under human care or not. And so there can be, for example, a pig that is under human care and would be Bo, but the same pig, if it's out running around in the forest, becomes Romy. And then gives us the other example that children are always Mbo. The child does not begin as Romy and become Mbo. It is Mbo from the outset by virtue of its planting within the field of human relationships. So again, not equivalent to our understanding. Then into Mali, into the Dogon, where you have, again, this distinction between the garden and the bush. But for the Dogon, the bush is where all the power comes from. That you need it. And when they plant things in the garden, it gets used up or evaporates. And so again, it's, as Engels says on page 84, an almost exact inversion of the modern Western notion of food production as the manifestation of human knowledge and power over nature. Here it is nature in the form of the bush that holds ultimate power over human life. So that's where you get your power. And in the cultivated fields are sites of consumption rather than production, where vital force is used up. So again, very different. Finally, the peasant farmers of Boyacá, Colombia, who have very similar ideas to some of the peasant farmers that I worked with in a place not too far away from Goodman and Rivera's field experience here. And, you know, I would hear people talking about it. It didn't always make sense to me until it, I think they draw out well the ideas of this. In this case, it is that the earth is where people get their power. It's not people imposing their will upon the earth. The earth, and in some ways before that, God is our strength and our energy and force, our fuerza, and the farmers are assisting or helping to draw out that force. And so again, sort of kind of almost the opposite of our idea that when we are producing, that people are the key factor in making things out of nature and making nature produce. So, we have examples from Africa, Papua New Guinea, a couple different places in South America, although one of them are the peasant farmers, and one of them we might consider to be a more indigenous community. And what Ingold is saying is that in all of these examples, what we never see is this idea that there are social superior beings, the people, who are acting upon nature. And we also never see that the idea of humans controlling nature. They have different ideas about what's going on, the relationship between the garden and the bush, or between the earth and the humans, but never the idea that humans are somehow the ones dominating and controlling this process, or engineering something from it. What we do see in all of the examples is the idea that what people do is grow things, or maybe even different than that we set up the conditions for growth. And in many of these cases, there's a parallel. What's the parallel to? Willow, what else do we help to set up the conditions of growth for? Raising children. Yeah, it's like what they often parallel this to bringing up children, setting up conditions for growth. And in fact, in the example from Mount Hagen, was it? No. Oh, no, it was the Amazonian region. There was sort of a competition of motherhood between the plants that might, compete with the mother's attention for the kids. So I never understood until children started to be outside the home more, and our house started filling up with all these plants, and all of a sudden there's all these plants to take care of, move around and water. Crucially, I think, well, what's the difference between the way some people try to raise their kids and the way they think of it?
We treat kids not like they're little people, but I don't know, like receptacle. I didn't say it, but receptacle, like rules and stuff. We're just kind of like do this, but don't do this, rather than being like letting them be themselves.
Yeah, no, we often think of children as these savage animals that we have to train into civilization and stamp them with, all the rules and regulations of society. And so I would really recommend this. It's been today's my daughter's 18th birthday, and started reading Ingold with her. It's really helped me out. It's a lot different to think about just letting your child grow into social maturity. As much as I want to stamp and train, and no, you have to set up the conditions for growth. You can't do that much. That's my feeling. So again, in these societies, the idea is not that we take a savage child or an animal child or a blank slate child and then train them or make a mold for them or civilize them. They grow like plants or animals into maturity. And so what Ingold is saying here is that when it comes to the distinction between the domesticated and the wild, it's and page 86 is really crucial or key. Where does this leave the distinctions between gathering and cultivation, between hunting and animal husbandry? The difference surely lies in no more than this: the relative scope of human involvement in establishing the conditions for growth. The relative scope. This is a matter of degree rather than kind. And this is a crucial sort of social science sentence that you should always keep in mind. A matter of degree rather than kind, meaning that there are various gradations along perhaps a continuum rather than some sort of split on one side or the other. So it's a matter of degree rather than kind. It can also vary over time. Weeds can become cultigens, so stuff that looks like a weed, all of a sudden you're eating it. Erstwhile domestic animals can turn feral. For those of you who've been trying to fight off the wild hog population, you know what this is like. They're everywhere. They're going crazy, ruining everything. I think in Texas, they've allowed you to shoot them as from a machine gun from the helicopter. So yes, domestic animals can turn feral, can go wild. And then, you know, he makes a really interesting point about the temporal, the ways in which what seems to have happened is that humans started relying on faster reproducing plants and faster reproducing animals. And that's in some ways what may be more an explanation for what we call domestication. And he also goes into the idea of, you know, in some ways, in many places, trees are hugely important for humans and the stuff that humans get from trees, but they don't really fit these ideas of, you know, wild and domesticated. And so it's, you know, and it's interesting because it is true when you look in the literature, they never want to talk about trees because, you know, it's hard to imagine selectively breeding a tree. I mean, we try, or, you know, we could have tried. So Engels returns to, you know, what then is the place of humans, and makes the declaration that we can no longer think of humans, as on page 87, as inhabiting a social world of their own over and above the world of nature, in which the lives of all other living things are contained. This idea that there's a social world up above and a natural world below. Instead, we need to look at ourselves as fellow participants in the same world, and that humans we don't so much transform the world, but instead play their part along with other creatures in the world's transformation of itself, which is a really interesting and different way to look at things, especially from our own society. And we've seen this a little bit before, back if you think about chapter 2, pages 38 to 39, where he's talking about the people who call themselves scientists and the people who call themselves hunter-gatherers as being fellow passengers in this world of ours in a long history of engagement. Or back on page 76, when we were talking about the hunters and the herders, and that we need to we should not judge our disengagement, use our disengagement as a standard against which to judge their disengagement. Oh no, wait, sorry. We can't use our disengagement as a standard against which to judge their engagement. That's when he talks about the ecological crisis. So it's a very different, I hope, a very provocative way of thinking about human environment interactions and those kinds of things. And again, pairing these chapters together, the last chapter on hunting and herding together with this chapter on domestication, really, I hope serves to gel things together and crystallize a number of the things that Engels been talking about up to